Okay, so hello. I'm going to talk to you today about magical realism. So, magical realism, or magic realism, is an approach to literature that weaves fantasy and myth into our everyday life. So it has you questioning what's real, what's imaginary, because both intermingle. In the world of magical realism, the ordinary becomes extraordinary and the magical becomes commonplace. Now, that's very important, that word commonplace, because in magical realism, nobody is particularly shocked when, the jam jar turns into a mystical sage or the cat starts talking to you. It's the mixing of the ordinary with the extraordinary. So I was thinking about it, and the most likely place that you'll have come across any magical realism before is in film. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with the work of the Studio Ghibli team from Japan, but you may have seen films like Spirited Away or Ponyo or My Neighbor Totoro. They're examples of magical realism. If you think about in My Neighbor Totoro, the two little girls running around a forest and then come upon an amazing sprite and nobody questions this or wonders why he's there or anything like that. Pan's Labyrinth, similar. They're all available on Netflix as well, by the way. The Studio Ghibli films, well worth watching in lockdown. They're very sweet. But then when it comes to books, lots of popular books that you may have read or at least heard of are magical realism. Books like 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, The Life of Pi, that was also turned into a film, and the very famous Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie. So, what then would make something an example of magical realism? So I'm going to talk to you about some of these features. Now, when you have a go at writing magical realism, you do not have to include all of these features. Even your entire finished piece is only going to be between 750 and 1,000 words, so you wouldn't have time to fit in all these features anyway. And like everything, nothing really fits into a little tidy box. So as long as what you're writing has a couple of elements of magical realism, then it's magical realism. So what sorts of things could you put in your writing? So you could have a situation or an event that defies logic. So in Laura Esquivel's novel, Like Water for Chocolate, which is a lovely romance, by the way, a woman forbidden to marry gets sort of her emotions out by pouring magic into food. Her desire to pass on the way she feels about the man she loves transforms into magical spells inside the food that she's making. I don't know what that is. It's very noisy. In Beloved, which is by the American author Toni Morrison, we have an escaped slave who moves into a house haunted by ghosts of an infant who died long ago. So it's much darker in that sense. So ghosts in that sense can be a feature of magical realism. You can just randomly have a ghost or a spirit in an otherwise ordinary life. So those are examples of two stories that are very different, yet both set in a world where truly anything can happen. Something else you could do is you could include elements of a myth or legend in your story. So much of the strangeness in magical realism derives from folklore or religious parables, allegories, superstitions. So an Bhikkhu, which is a West African spirit child, narrates the novel The Famished Road by Ben Okri. And in A Man Who Was Going Down the Road by the Georgian author Otar Childaz, merges an ancient Greek myth with the devastating events and history of his Eurasian homeland, which is near the Black Sea. So you can sort of just add elements of it, elements of Greek myths that you like, stories could become part of it, and that would make it magical realism. Something else, something in many ways a bit easier to do. You could just add in distorted time or distorted sequences. So in magical realism, characters may move backwards, leap forwards, or zigzag between the past and the future. It should, number 4, should definitely have a real world setting. Okay, that's what makes it magical realism and not fantasy. Okay, so it's not about space explorers or wizards. So it's not Star Wars and Harry Potter. They're both fantasy. They are not magical realism, because obviously in Harry Potter you have an entire magical world. We call that world building. You know, when you have Diagon Alley and Hogwarts and the Ministry of Magic, that's creating an entire magical world. All the magical events that happen in magical realism should happen in very ordinary spaces. So when he was writing The Telegraph, Salman Rushdie talked about this when he noted that the magic in magical realism has deep roots in what is real. So while there may be extraordinary events in the lives of the characters in your writing, they are ordinary people who live and exist in recognisable places. And tying into that, that's one of the reasons why it's important in magical realism for you to use a matter-of-fact tone to your writing. So the most characteristic feature of magical realism for many people is that the narrator's voice is dispassionate. You know, it's matter-of-fact, down-to-earth, unbothered. Bizarre events are described in a sort of offhand manner. Characters don't question the surreal situations they find themselves in. The cat starts talking to them and they sort of quite calmly start talking back to the cat. Okay. So, obviously magical realism is an enormous genre, and I'm going to try and tie it down just to one person. Now, that doesn't mean that if you decide to do magical realism that you have to do something you have to use a Haruki Murakami as your style model. You don't. You could choose another author. You could choose Toni Morrison or Salman Rushdie if you wanted, but we're going to look at Haruki Murakami for the next week, apart from Monday. But we're going to be thinking about Haruki Murakami and his writing, why it's magical realism, and then having a go at writing our own magical realism. So Haruki Murakami is perhaps the most famous Japanese author at the moment, and his style is magical realism. His books are just amazing. They are not difficult to read. They're extremely accessible and just extremely enjoyable. So yes, Japanese author. When we read his books, we read them in translation. They're written at first in Japanese, which means that those lucky Japanese people get to read his books first, and we people over here have to wait a little while. His most famous book is actually called Norwegian Wood, which isn't very magical realism-y, if that's a word, at all, but it's kind of what sprung him to fame. The film's on Netflix, I think, and it's absolutely beautiful. Just about young love and depression and disappointment. Now, his real fans rarely say it's their favourite and prefer other sort of more obviously magical realism texts like Dance, Dance, Dance or Kafka on the Shore, which we're going to look at today. Now, fans of Japanese culture will also love his books and his films. They're set in Japan, often in Tokyo, but not exclusively. His characters are often of a similar ilk, I would say. A main character who is in some ways very ordinary or sees themselves as very ordinary. But there are often other characters who are extremely enigmatic and cultured, creative. But yes, all of his books are about extraordinary things happening to self-proclaimed ordinary people. His main characters are always extremely humble and self-deprecating. Okay, so some things that typically happen in a Haruki Murakami novel. So, one moment you're having coffee and Dunkin' Donuts, and the next you're conversing with a mystical sheep who's giving you philosophical advice about in a cupboard. You're working, relaxing at a friend's house. There always seems to be multiple available spaces for people to be able to stay in Haruki Murakami's novel. No one's ever rich, really, but everybody always has enough money to get by. No one seems to have to go to work, or seems to have to be able to take huge gaps from work or university to go off and wander about and explore these places, which is always quite nice. So you're working and relaxing in one of your friends' houses for free, where you're staying and resting and doing your art, when you suddenly realise that there's a covered well in the back garden that contains a secret passageway into an unknown place, or takes you back in time, or something like that. There's lots of beautiful and elegant women with sad, painful stories, often who disappear. Somebody's normally psychic. These are sort of typical things that happen. And again, not all of these things would need to happen in your story for it to be magical realism. There'd just be some element of it. So, zooming in again, obviously we're not going to just talk about magical realism, and we're not just going to talk about Haruki Murakami. We are going to come down and look at one story in particular, and that one is Kafka on the Shore. So in order to get a feel for magical realism and the writing of Haruki Murakami in general, we're going to read the first chapter of the novel Kafka on the Shore. So I'm going to attach that to our thread in Teams, along with some other resources that you can look at if you become wildly obsessed with Haruki Murakami, which isn't a bad thing to do, and a good time for it to happen. Anyway, here's the blurb from the book. So Kafka on the Shore is powered by two remarkable characters: a teenage boy, Kafka, Tamura, who runs away from home, that's either to escape a gruesome Oedipal prophecy or to search for his long-missing mother and sister. It's also about an aging simpleton called Nakata, who never recovered from a wartime affliction and now is drawn towards Kafka for reasons that, like most basic activities of daily life, he cannot fathom. As their paths converge, and the reasons for that convergence become clear, Haruki Murakami unfolds readers in a world where cats talk, fish fall from the sky, and spirits slip out of their bodies to make love or commit murder. Kafka on the Shore displays one of the world's great storytellers at the peak of his powers. Okay. So, just a little further reading there, some interviews with and about Haruki Murakami, but the main thing I want you to do now is go back to the thread, open the document that has the first chapter of Kafka on the Shore, read it and enjoy it, and then comment below with what you think the story is about and what you think its features might be. Thank you very much.